His fingers were still wrapped around her wrist. The drunk customer who thought a pregnant waitress was easy prey. When the quiet man from the corner booth rose, crossed the diner in 3 unhurried steps, and broke his arm so cleanly that the snap silenced every voice in the room. The scream came half a second later. It tore through the afternoon haze of Mabel's diner, scattering the lazy comfort of clinking coffee cups and murmured conversations. Forks froze mid-air. A trucker near the window stopped chewing. The jukebox in the corner kept playing something sweet and country, utterly wrong for the moment unfolding beneath the dusty Tennessee sun. Hannah Moore stood frozen, her freed wrist throbbing, her other hand pressed instinctively against her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant, exhausted, terrified, but not for herself. For the child, always for the child, the drunk man. Travis, she'd heard his friends call him, crumpled to the linoleum floor, clutching his arm where it bent in a direction God never intended. His face had gone white. Sweat beaded across his forehead. The bravado that had fueled his grip, his wandering eyes, his slurred comments all afternoon, evaporated into nothing but animal pain. The quiet stranger stood over him without a trace of exertion on his face. Hannah had noticed him earlier, corner booth, back to the wall. He'd ordered black coffee and never touched it. His clothes were too fine for this stretch of interstate, his stillness too deliberate for a man just passing through. She'd felt his gaze once or twice but dismissed it. Men looked at her all the time. She'd learned to move through their attention like water through a sieve. But this man had not been looking at her the way Travis had. He'd been watching, waiting. Now he stood between her and the man who'd grabbed her, and the calm radiating off him was more terrifying than any violence she'd ever witnessed. Travis's friends scrambled from their booth. One reached for the stranger's shoulder. The stranger moved. Lost fast, too precise. And suddenly both men were on the ground, gasping, disabled by strikes Hannah hadn't even fully seen. 3 men, 3 seconds. The stranger hadn't broken a sweat. The diner had become a tomb of silence. Hannah's breath came in shallow bursts. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She wanted to run, to hide, to wake up from whatever nightmare had swallowed her ordinary afternoon. But her legs refused to move. The stranger turned to her. His eyes were dark, unreadable. But when they met hers, something shifted. The ice thawed by a single degree. His voice, when he spoke, was low and soft, meant only for her. "You're safe now." She opened her mouth. No words came. He glanced at her belly, at the protective curl of her arm around it, and something flickered across his expression. Pain, recognition, a ghost of something old and unhealed. "I should have moved sooner," he said. "I'm sorry." "Sorry?" This stranger had just shattered a man's arm for touching her, and he was apologizing for not acting fast enough? "Who?" Hannah's voice cracked. She swallowed and tried again. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, he said something that would echo in her mind for days, for weeks, for the rest of her life. "No one touches what's mine." She shook her head, confusion cutting through the fog of adrenaline. "I don't even know you." "I know." Doors banged open behind her. Men in dark suits poured in. Lost many too coordinated. They moved like a unit, like soldiers, securing exits and herding the few remaining customers into calm compliance. One of them approached the stranger with deference that bordered on reverence. "Sir, we've handled the perimeter. What do you want done with them, sir?" Hannah's blood turned cold. She looked at the stranger again, at his tailored clothes, his scarred knuckles, the way every person in the room oriented toward him like planets around a sun. This man was not a traveller passing through. He was something else entirely. He met her gaze, and for a moment the mask slipped. Beneath the control, beneath the violence, she saw something human, something wounded. "Get her a chair," he said quietly. "Water, whatever she needs." He turned away, issuing orders in a voice too low for her to hear, and Hannah sank into the nearest booth on trembling legs. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know he ruled an empire built on shadows and blood. All she knew was that 5 minutes ago she had been alone in the world, and now, somehow, she wasn't. Before I tell you how Hannah ended up in that grip, and who this quiet stranger really is, like this video and drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far Hannah's story travels. 4 hours earlier, Hannah woke to the flutter of tiny feet against her ribs. She lay still in the grey morning light, one hand pressed to her belly, counting the kicks the way other people counted blessings. 1, 3. The baby was active today, restless. Maybe it sensed what she tried so hard to hide, that the world waiting outside this cramped studio apartment had no space for either of them. The ceiling above her bed was cracked. a long fracture running from the corner to the center like a river on a map leading nowhere. She'd memorized every inch of it during sleepless nights, during the hours when fear wrapped around her chest and squeezed until she couldn't breathe. 7 months pregnant, 23 years old, completely alone. The father's name was Ryan. She didn't let herself think it often because thinking it meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling, and feeling meant falling apart. He'd been charming, attentive, full of promises that dissolved like sugar in rain. The moment the pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines, he'd shown her exactly who he was. "I'm not ready for this," he'd said, already backing toward the door. "I can't do this." He was gone before she could respond. Blocked her number by nightfall. Moved out of state within the week. That was 6 months ago. She hadn't heard from him since. Hannah pushed herself upright, ignoring the ache in her lower back, the heaviness in her legs. The clock on the nightstand read 6:47. Her shift at Mabel's started at 11, but the bus took nearly an hour, and she needed time to make herself presentable. Presentable, what a word. As if concealer could hide the purple shadows under her eyes. As if a loose sweater could make customers forget she was pregnant, could make them see a waitress instead of a target. She moved through her morning routine on autopilot. Shower, dress, a careful application of makeup that transformed exhaustion into something resembling alertness. She pulled on a dark sweater 2 sizes too large, the fabric draping over her belly in a way that minimized its curve. Some customers tipped less when they saw she was expecting. Others tipped more but wanted something in return. A smile held too long, a laugh at jokes that weren't funny, tolerance for hands that wandered too close. She'd learned to navigate all of it. Survival meant staying invisible, staying polite, enduring. The kitchen counter held a stack of envelopes she hadn't opened. Water bill, a letter from the landlord with red ink visible through the window of the envelope. She knew what it said, 60 days. She had 60 days to come up with 3 months of back rent or find herself on the street. Hannah poured a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink, staring at nothing. She couldn't think about the eviction notice. Not today. Today, she needed to work. She needed to smile and carry plates and pretend her feet didn't ache, pretend her heart wasn't heavy, pretend she had any idea how she was going to raise a child in a world that kept trying to crush her. The bus arrived at 9:15, half empty and smelling of diesel. Hannah found a seat near the back and watched rural Tennessee scroll past the window. Fields of brown grass, clusters of pine trees, billboards advertising churches and car dealerships and personal injury lawyers. The landscape felt like her life, flat, endless, offering no clear direction forward. She pressed her hand to her belly again. The baby kicked twice, quick and insistent. "I know," she whispered. "I'm scared too." Mabel's diner appeared on the horizon at 10:40, a faded blue building squatting beside the interstate, like it had given up trying to look impressive decades ago. The parking lot held a handful of trucks, a few sedans, nothing unusual. Hannah stepped off the bus and walked across the gravel, the late morning sun warm on her shoulders. Inside, the smell of coffee and bacon grease wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. Mabel stood behind the counter, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. "You're early," Mabel said. "Wanted to get settled before the rush." Mabel studied her for a moment, then lowered her voice. "Listen, honey, there's a group of men came in about an hour ago. Truckers, I think. They've been drinking something they brought in themselves, and they're getting loud. Just keep your distance if you can." Hannah nodded, tying her apron around what remained of her waist. "I can handle it." "I know you can." Mabel's expression softened. "That's what worries me." The afternoon stretched ahead, ordinary and unremarkable. Hannah filled salt shakers, wiped down tables, and prepared herself for another shift of polite smiles and aching feet. She'd survived worse than rowdy truckers. She'd survived Ryan. She'd survived her father walking out when she was 12. She'd survived her mother's silence, her own loneliness, every closed door and empty promise life had thrown at her. She would survive this too, she always did. But what Hannah didn't know was that in exactly 3 hours a man would walk through that door who would change everything. And he wasn't one of the truckers. The lunch rush faded like a tide pulling back from shore, leaving behind scattered plates and half-empty coffee cups. By 2 o'clock, the diner had settled into its afternoon lull, a handful of customers nursing drinks, the ceiling fans turning lazy circles overhead, the heat pressing against the windows like something trying to get in. Hannah cleared a table near the door, her movements automatic, her mind drifting to the bills waiting at home. She calculated tips in her head. $14 so far. Not enough. Never enough. The sound of tires on gravel pulled her attention to the window. A black sedan rolled into the parking lot, sleek and polished, so out of place against the dusty trucks and dented cars that it might as well have arrived from another planet. The afternoon sun glinted off its surface like a warning. Hannah watched it park in the far corner of the lot, positioned for a quick exit. The driver's door opened. The man who emerged moved with a kind of controlled grace that made her breath catch. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in charcoal trousers and a white shirt that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His dark hair was cut short, his jaw sharp, his expression carved from something harder than stone. He crossed the parking lot without hurry, but every step carried intention, purpose. When he pushed through the diner's front door, Hannah felt the atmosphere shift. The air grew heavier, charged with something she couldn't name. His eyes swept the room before the door had fully closed behind him. She watched him catalogue everything. The exits, the customers, the layout of tables and booths, in the span of a single breath. It was subtle. Someone else might have missed it. But Hannah had spent her whole life reading people, learning to spot danger before it arrived, and she recognized the scan of a man who expected trouble and planned to survive it. He chose the corner booth, back to the wall, face to the door. Hannah grabbed a menu and a glass of water, steadying herself before she approached. She'd served handsome men before. She'd served dangerous men before. Something told her this stranger was both, and the combination made her cautious in ways she couldn't fully explain. "Afternoon," she said, setting the water down. "Can I get you started with something?" He looked up at her, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between them. His eyes were dark brown, nearly black and utterly unreadable. They held hers without aggression, without invitation, just a steady, assessing gaze that made her feel seen in a way she wasn't sure she liked. "Black coffee," he said. His voice was low, smooth, carrying an accent she couldn't place. Nothing else. Coming right up. She turned to leave, but something made her glance back. He wasn't watching her anymore. His attention had shifted to the window, to the parking lot beyond, to something or someone she couldn't see. Yet she had the strangest feeling that even with his gaze elsewhere, he remained aware of exactly where she stood. At the counter, she poured his coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Mabel caught her eye from the kitchen doorway, one silver eyebrow raised in question. Hannah shook her head. Nothing's wrong. Just a customer. But when she returned to his booth and set the cup down, she let herself look at him more closely. His hands rested on the table, fingers loosely interlaced. She noticed the scars across his knuckles, old wounds, long healed, speaking of violence that had become routine. An expensive watch circled his left wrist. No wedding ring. "Thank you," he said without looking up. "Let me know if you need anything else." She walked away, but she felt his gaze follow her, not the hungry stare she'd grown accustomed to from men like Travis Holloway. This was different, observational, almost clinical. Adrian Cole watched the pregnant waitress move through the diner, and something old and buried stirred in his chest. He hadn't planned to notice her. He'd come to Mabel's diner for a meeting, a routine exchange of information, with a contact who worked the trucking routes through this part of Tennessee. The location was deliberate, anonymous, forgettable, far from the territories where his name carried weight. But his contact was late, and the waitress kept drawing his attention. She was tired. He could see it in the shadows beneath her eyes, in the careful way she moved to minimize the ache he knew she must be feeling. 7 months pregnant, maybe more, working a job that kept her on her feet for hours. Her smile never wavered, but it never reached her eyes either. He watched her deflect a comment from the cook, something crude, based on the man's laughter and her tight expression. She handled it with practiced ease, her response light enough to avoid conflict, firm enough to establish a boundary. A few minutes later, a customer at the counter made a joke that turned her cheeks pink, and she laughed it off the same way, giving nothing, tolerating everything. Survival. He recognized the pattern. He'd seen it before. 15 years ago, in a convenience store parking lot, in the desperate eyes of a pregnant girl who'd looked to him for protection he'd failed to provide. Adrian's jaw tightened. He lifted his coffee, found it had gone cold without him taking a single sip. "Why?" The waitress passed his booth again, balancing plates with an efficiency born of necessity. She winced as she walked. A small grimace she probably thought no one noticed. He noticed. He noticed the loose sweater meant to hide her belly, the worn shoes that offered no support, the way she counted tips under her breath when she thought no one was looking. She reminded him of Grace. Not in appearance. Grace had been fair-haired, laughing, full of a brightness that made the world seem kinder than it was. This woman carried a different kind of light. Dimmer, harder one, flickering against a wind that never stopped blowing. But the vulnerability was the same. The strength wrapped around it like armor was the same. And the feeling rising in his chest, the old familiar urge to stand between her and whatever darkness circled, that was the same too. He couldn't protect Grace. He'd hesitated, and she'd paid the price. He wouldn't hesitate again. Travis Holloway had been trouble since the moment he walked in. Hannah had clocked him and his two companions the second they'd settled into the booth near the window just after noon. They'd ordered sodas, but she'd seen the flash of a metal flask passing between them under the table. By 1 o'clock, their voices had grown louder. By 2, their laughter had taken on that sharp, reckless edge that made her stomach tighten. Travis was the loudest of the three, mid-40s, thick-necked, with the kind of face that might have been handsome 20 years and 100 bad decisions ago. He wore a trucking company polo stretched tight across his gut and a baseball cap pulled low over small, restless eyes. Everything about him broadcast a man who mistook intimidation for charm, who believed the world owed him something and resented it for not paying up. Hannah had seen his type before. She'd learned to recognize them the way animals learn to recognize predators. By instinct, by the prickle at the back of her neck, by the way her body tensed before her mind caught up. She kept her distance through the early afternoon, letting Leo, the cook, handle their refills when possible. But Leo had disappeared into the back for a cigarette break, and Mabel had gone to run errands. And suddenly Hannah was alone on the floor with a diner that felt too empty and a booth of drunk men whose attention had begun to drift in her direction. She felt Travis's gaze before she saw it. It crawled over her skin like something with legs, slow, deliberate, violating. She was clearing a table near the counter when she heard his voice carry across the room loud enough to ensure she wouldn't miss it. "Look at that! Pregnant and still working." He let out a low whistle. Bet the daddy ran off. They always do with girls like that. His companions laughed. One of them muttered something she couldn't hear, and Travis responded with a grin that made her skin crawl. "Desperate," he said, louder now. "Girls like that are always desperate. Probably do anything for a good tip." Hannah's hands trembled as she stacked dirty plates. She forced herself to breathe, to stay calm, to remember that she needed this job, needed every dollar, needed to make it through this shift without incident. She adjusted her route, circling the long way around to avoid passing their booth. But the diner was small, and there were only so many paths she could take. She felt Travis tracking her movements, felt his gaze follow her like a spotlight she couldn't escape. From his corner booth, Adrian Cole watched. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, untouched, forgotten. His contact had never arrived, a problem he would deal with later. Right now his attention was fixed on the three men by the window and the pregnant waitress doing everything in her power to stay out of their reach. He saw the way she altered her path, saw the tension in her shoulders, the false brightness of her smile, saw the fear she was trying so hard to hide. And he saw the way the man in the baseball cap watched her, the way his eyes lingered too long on her body, the way his expression shifted from amusement to something hungrier each time she passed. Adrian's hands rested flat on the table, still, patient. But beneath the stillness something cold and familiar was waking up. "Hey, sweetheart!" Travis's voice cut through the diner like a blade. Hannah froze mid-step, her back to his booth. "Yeah, you, pregnant girl. Come here." She turned slowly, the professional smile locked in place. "What can I get for you?" "Refills." He shook his half-full glass, ice rattling. "We're running dry over here." The glasses were nowhere near empty. She knew it, he knew it. That wasn't the point. "Of course," she said. "I'll be right back." She returned with a pitcher of cola, keeping her movements efficient, her eyes downcast. She refilled each glass without making eye contact, without giving them anything to latch onto. As she turned to leave, Travis's hand shot out, not to grab her, not yet, but to knock a napkin off the table. It fluttered to the floor at her feet. "Oops." His smile was slow, mean. "Mind picking that up for me, darling?" Hannah looked at the napkin, looked at Travis, looked at the angle she'd have to bend to reach it, the vulnerability of the position, the way his eyes were already traveling down her body in anticipation. Something inside her went very still. "I'll get you a fresh one," she said evenly. She walked away without bending, without giving him what he wanted. Behind her, the laughter from the booth died abruptly. She felt the shift in the air, felt the moment Travis's amusement curdled into something darker. A man like him didn't hear no often. When he did, he didn't hear it as a boundary. He heard it as a challenge. At the counter, Hannah's hand shook as she grabbed a clean napkin. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She told herself it was fine. He was just a drunk idiot. He'd finish his soda and leave, and she'd never see him again. She told herself a lot of things that afternoon. None of them turned out to be true. If you're already feeling your stomach knot, you're not alone. Hit that like button. Because what happens next? I still can't believe it. Adrian hadn't moved from his booth, hadn't spoken, hadn't drawn attention to himself in any way. But his eyes never left the man in the baseball cap, and his body had shifted almost imperceptibly. Weight forward, muscles loose, ready. He'd seen that look before, the wounded pride, the quiet rage of a man denied something he believed he deserved. Travis watched Hannah walk away, and something ugly settled into his jaw. The set of his shoulders changed. His fingers drummed against the table in a rhythm that matched the mounting pressure behind his eyes. He wasn't done. Men like him were never done until they'd taken something. The afternoon stretched like taffy, slow and thick, each minute dragging into the next. By 3:30, the diner had emptied to a skeleton crew of customers. A young couple sat near the door, wrapped up in each other, oblivious to anything beyond their shared basket of fries. The stranger in the corner booth remained motionless, a statue carved from patience and shadow, and Travis Holloway's group lingered by the window, their laughter growing louder, their movements looser, their flask making more frequent appearances. Hannah counted the minutes until the end of her shift. 45 more. She could survive 45 more minutes. She busied herself with tasks that didn't need doing. Wiping down clean tables, straightening salt shakers, refilling napkin dispensers, anything to keep moving, anything to avoid standing still long enough for Travis's gaze to settle on her again. The air in the diner felt wrong, heavy, charged with something she couldn't name but could feel pressing against her skin. Every instinct she'd honed over years of navigating dangerous men screamed at her to leave, to walk out the back door and never look back. But she needed this job. She needed the money. She needed to prove she could handle whatever life threw at her. So she stayed. She was clearing the table closest to the restrooms when she heard the creak of the booth by the window. Heavy footsteps on linoleum. The shuffle of a man who'd been drinking for hours trying to walk a straight line. Hannah didn't turn around. She moved faster, stacking plates, reaching for empty glasses, hoping that if she looked busy enough, occupied enough, he would pass her by. He didn't. "Where are you running off to, sweetheart?" Travis's voice came from directly behind her. Close. Too close. She could smell the alcohol on his breath, sour and sharp, mingling with stale sweat and cheap cologne. Hannah straightened slowly, plates balanced in her hands. She kept her expression neutral, her voice steady. "Just doing my job, sir. Can I help you with something?" "Sir," he laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "I like that. Polite. You're real polite, ain't you?" She didn't answer. She stepped to the left, trying to move around him toward the counter. He stepped with her, blocking her path. "Asks you a question earlier," he said. His eyes travelled down her body with an ownership that made her stomach turn. "You never did pick up that napkin. I got you a fresh one." "That ain't what I asked for." Hannah's grip tightened on the plates. Her heart had begun to pound, a drumbeat of warning that echoed in her ears. She glanced toward the kitchen. Leo was nowhere to be seen. She looked at the couple by the door. They were laughing at something on a phone screen, deliberately not looking in her direction. "I need to get back to work," she said quietly. "Please let me pass." Travis smiled. It was the worst smile she'd ever seen, empty of warmth, full of intent. "Please," he repeated, mocking her tone. "I like it when they say please." His hand shot out. Fingers closed around her wrist like a vice. The plates slipped from her grasp, shattering against the floor in an explosion of ceramic shards, but Hannah barely heard it. Every nerve in her body had ignited with a single primal message. Danger. "Don't," she whispered, pulling back against his grip. "Please, let go." He laughed again, delighted by her fear, feeding on it. "Relax, honey. Just being friendly." His free hand rose, reaching toward her belly. Always wondered what it felt like. A pregnant girl. "Just wanna..." Time fractured. The world slowed to a crawl, each second stretching into an eternity. Hannah saw his hand moving toward her stomach, saw the hungry curiosity in his eyes, saw the future unfolding in a single terrible moment. His touch, her violation, her child exposed to hands that had no right to be there, her free arm wrapped around her belly. Instinct, protection, the only thing that mattered. She heard herself make a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and hated how small it was, how helpless. She pulled against his grip again, harder this time, but his fingers only tightened until she felt the bones in her wrist grinding together. "Stop fighting," he breathed. "Makes it worse when you fight." Terror flooded her veins. Not for herself, for the baby, for the tiny life she'd sworn to protect, the only thing in this world that was truly hers. She looked around the diner one last time, desperate, pleading. The couple by the door had gone completely still. their eyes fixed on the table in front of them. They saw, they knew. They chose not to act. The kitchen door remained closed. Leo had vanished into the back, into safety, leaving her alone. Travis's companions watched from the booth, grinning, entertained by the show. No one was coming. No one was going to help her. No one ever did. Hannah felt something inside her crack. Not break, she wouldn't give him that, but fracture along fault lines she'd spent years trying to ignore. She was alone. She'd always been alone, and in this moment, with this man's hand clamped around her wrist and his other hand inches from her unborn child, she understood that alone was the only thing she would ever be. His fingers brushed her sweater, seeking the curve of her belly beneath. She closed her eyes. A chair scraped against the floor. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. Hannah's eyes flew open. Footsteps, measured, unhurried, crossing the diner with the steady rhythm of a man who had never once hurried in his life and never would. A shadow fell over them both. A voice, soft as silk wrapped around the blade, spoke from somewhere above Travis's shoulder. Let her go. Adrian Cole stood 3 feet away, hands loose at his sides, his posture so relaxed he might have been waiting for a bus. But his eyes told a different story. They were fixed on Travis with the flat, patient focus of a predator deciding exactly how to end a hunt. No anger, no heat, just cold, absolute certainty. Travis turned his head, keeping his grip locked on Hannah's wrist. His lip curled when he saw the stranger from the corner booth, the pretty boy in expensive clothes who'd been nursing cold coffee all afternoon. "Mind your business," Travis said. "This ain't got nothing to do with you. I said let her go." The words were quiet, conversational. They carried no aggression, no bluster, and that was what made them terrifying, the complete absence of doubt, as if the outcome had already been decided, and Travis simply hadn't realized it yet. Hannah felt the shift in Travis's body, the flicker of uncertainty beneath the bravado. He was drunk, but not drunk enough to miss the danger radiating off the man in front of him. Or what? Travis laughed. But it came out wrong. Too loud. Too forced. "You gonna make me?" Movement from the booth by the window. Travis's companions were rising, chairs scraping back, hands curling into fists. 2 against 1, and they liked those odds. Adrian didn't glance at them, didn't acknowledge their existence. His attention remained fixed on Travis with an intensity that made the air feel thin. Last chance. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. A simple statement of cause and effect, delivered with the calm of a man who had issued similar warnings 100 times before and knew exactly what happened when they went unheeded. Travis's jaw tightened. Pride and alcohol warred with a survival instinct screaming at him to back down, to let go, to walk away. But men like Travis didn't walk away. Men like Travis had spent their whole lives taking what they wanted, and no pretty boy in a tailored shirt was going to change that. He yanked Hannah closer, pulling her against his chest like a shield. His breath was hot and sour against her ear. "How about you sit back down before you get hurt?" he said. "Me and the lady are just having a conversation." Adrian's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went very, very dark. What happened next took 2 seconds. Adrian moved like water, finding the path of least resistance, fluid, inevitable, impossible to stop. One moment he was standing 3 feet away. The next, his hand had clamped around Travis's wrist with surgical precision, breaking his grip on Hannah so cleanly she stumbled back without feeling the release. In the same motion, Adrian's other hand seized Travis's arm above the elbow. A twist. A pivot, the application of force in exactly the right direction. The crack echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Travis screamed. His arm bent backward at the elbow, folding in a direction human joints were never meant to fold. He dropped to the floor, howling, clutching the ruined limb against his chest. His face had gone the color of curdled milk. Tears streamed down his cheeks. The diner erupted. Travis's companions lunged forward with the clumsy aggression of men who'd never faced real violence in their lives. The first one swung a wild haymaker at Adrian's head. Adrian stepped inside the arc of the punch, drove a precise strike into the man's throat, and let momentum do the rest. The attacker crumpled, gagging, hands clutching his windpipe. The second man was faster, smarter. He tried to tackle Adrian low, take him to the ground where numbers might matter. Adrian sidestepped, caught him by the collar, and brought a knee up into his solar plexus with enough force to empty his lungs entirely. The man folded like wet paper, gasping for air that wouldn't come. 3 men on the ground. 4 seconds total. Adrian Cole hadn't broken a sweat. He straightened his cuffs with the casual indifference of a man who'd done nothing more strenuous than brush lint from his sleeve. His breathing hadn't changed. His expression remained composed, controlled, utterly at ease. The diner had gone silent as a tomb. The couple by the door sat frozen, their faces pale with shock. Somewhere in the back, a pot clattered. Leo, finally emerging to witness the aftermath of something he'd been too cowardly to prevent. Adrian turned to Hannah. The transformation was immediate. The coldness drained from his features like water through sand. His shoulders softened. His eyes, which moments ago had held nothing but lethal focus, now carried something almost gentle. He approached her slowly, the way one might approach a frightened animal, giving her space to retreat if she needed it. "You're safe," he said. His voice had dropped to something just above a whisper. "He can't hurt you anymore." Hannah stared at him. Her body trembled with aftershocks of adrenaline, with fear, with relief so profound it threatened to buckle her knees. Tears blurred her vision, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. She didn't know this man. She didn't understand what had just happened. She didn't know why he'd intervened, why he'd moved so fast, why he'd shattered another man's arm for the crime of touching her. And she definitely didn't understand what he'd said before. "What's mine?" As if she belonged to him. As if he had any claim to her at all. But standing in that diner, surrounded by broken men and shattered plates, with her wrist still throbbing and her baby safe beneath her protective arm, none of that mattered. What mattered was that someone had come. Someone had seen her fear and answered it with action instead of averted eyes. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Hannah Moore was not alone. "I'm sorry," Adrian said quietly. "I should have acted sooner. I saw him watching you, and I waited too long." She shook her head, unable to form words, unable to do anything but stand there and tremble and cry. He didn't touch her, didn't reach for her. Simply stood close enough that she could feel his presence like a wall between her and everything that had tried to hurt her. "It's over," he said. "You're safe now." And somehow, impossibly, she believed him. If that just made your heart stop, you're not the only one. Drop a comment. Do you think what he did was justified? I need to hear your take on this. Silence swallowed the diner whole. It pressed against the walls, filled the spaces between overturned chairs and shuttered plates, wrapped around the moans of the three men bleeding on the floor. Even the jukebox had fallen quiet, the cheerful country song ending mid-verse, as if the machine itself understood that music had no place in this moment. Hannah stood motionless, her hand still pressed to her belly, her body trembling with the echoes of adrenaline. The stranger, Adrian, she'd heard someone call him, remained beside her, a silent sentinel, his calm so complete it felt almost unnatural. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask one of the 1,000 questions crowding her mind when the front door exploded inward. Men poured through the entrance. 5, 6, 7 of them, dressed in dark suits, moving with the coordinated precision of soldiers executing a drill. They secured the exits first, then the perimeter, then turned their attention to the chaos in the center of the room. Not a single one of them spoke. Not a single one of them hesitated. Hannah stumbled backward, her heart lurching into her throat. More danger, more violence. She needed to run, needed to hide, needed to protect her baby from whatever fresh nightmare was unfolding around her. A hand caught her elbow, gentle, steadying. "There with me," Adrian said quietly. "You're safe." She looked up at him, uncomprehending. With him? These men in their expensive suits and their cold, efficient movements were with him? Who was he that he commanded an army? The suited men worked with frightening speed. 2 of them hauled Travis to his feet, ignoring his screams as his shattered arm dangled uselessly at his side. His companions were collected next, dragged toward the back exit like refuse being cleared away. One of the men produced a roll of cash and moved toward the couple by the door who had gone pale as ghosts and sat rigid in their booth. Hannah watched him count out bills, hundreds by the look of them, and press them into the young man's trembling hands. "You didn't see anything," the suited man said. His voice was pleasant, conversational, utterly terrifying. "You were never here." "Understood?" The couple nodded frantically. They fled moments later, leaving their half-eaten fries behind. Another man approached Leo, who had emerged from the kitchen and stood frozen near the counter, his face slack with shock. The same exchange. The same stack of bills, the same quiet instructions delivered with a smile that promised consequences for disobedience. Hannah watched it all unfold with the detached horror of a passenger in a car crash, unable to intervene, unable to look away, unable to fully process the magnitude of what she was witnessing. The back door of the diner opened. Mabel stepped through, her silver hair disheveled, her apron askew. She must have been in the storage room, must have heard the commotion and hidden until she deemed it safe to emerge. Her eyes swept the scene, the suited men, the blood on the floor, the shattered dishes, and landed on Adrian. Her face went white. "Mr. Cole," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the name, fracturing it into something between recognition and fear. I didn't know you were. I'm so sorry. If I'd known. She was trembling. Mabel, who had survived 60 years in rural Tennessee, who had run this diner through recessions and floods and the deaths of 2 husbands, was trembling like a leaf before a man 30 years her junior. Mr. Cole. Hannah turned to look at Adrian, really look at him, not at the handsome face or the tailored clothes or the scarred knuckles, but at the way the room oriented around him. Every man in a suit tracked his movements, awaited his commands, deferred to him with a respect that bordered on reverence. Mabel couldn't meet his eyes. Leo had pressed himself against the far wall as if hoping to disappear into it. This wasn't a businessman passing through on his way to somewhere important. This wasn't a good Samaritan who happened to have combat training. This was something else entirely, something that commanded fear from people who had no reason to give it, something that moved through the world with an entourage and the expectation of obedience. Adrian met her gaze. For a moment, the mask slipped. Beneath the composure, beneath the control, she saw something she hadn't expected. Uncertainty, vulnerability. The flicker of a man who suddenly cared very much what she thought of him and feared the answer. I owe you an explanation, he said. Who are you? The question hung between them, heavy with implications she was only beginning to understand. Around them, his men continued their work, cleaning up the mess, erasing the evidence, transforming the scene of violence into something that could be forgotten. But Adrian's attention remained fixed on her, as if she were the only person in the room who mattered. He didn't answer immediately. She watched him weigh his words, watched him consider and discard responses, watched him struggle with something that looked almost like honesty. Someone who should have protected you before it got that far, he finally said. Hannah shook her head. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. One of the suited men approached, stopping a respectful distance away. Sir, the situation is contained. What would you like us to do with them? Adrian didn't look away from Hannah. Take them to the facility. Have Dr. Bearer, Reeves look at the arm. Then we'll discuss what happens next. And the woman? For the first time, Adrian's expression hardened. Just a flash there and gone. But it sent a chill down Hannah's spine. The woman, he said softly, is under my protection. Make sure everyone understands that. The man nodded and withdrew. Hannah stared at Adrian, her mind racing to connect pieces that didn't fit together. Protection. An army of men in suits. A name that made Mabel tremble. Enemies being taken to a facility for processing. Who are you? She asked again, and this time her voice shook. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, almost apologetic. I think you already know, or you're starting to. She was. The truth was forming at the edges of her consciousness, too big to look at directly, too frightening to accept. But she couldn't stop it from taking shape any more than she could stop the sun from setting. Say it, she whispered. Tell me. He held her gaze. In his eyes, she saw something that might have been regret, or resignation, or the peculiar loneliness of a man who had long ago accepted that truth was a luxury he could rarely afford. Not here, he said, but I promise you'll understand everything. If you'll let me explain. She should have said no. She should have walked away, found another job, forgotten this afternoon ever happened. Every rational part of her brain screamed that nothing good could come from following this man down whatever dark path he walked. But rationality had never kept her safe. Caution had never protected her. She'd spent her whole life playing by the rules, and the rules had given her nothing but loneliness and fear and a pregnancy she was facing alone. Maybe it was time to try something different. Okay, she heard herself say. Explain. But that wasn't an answer. And when Hannah finally learned the truth, who Adrian Cole really was, what he controlled, and why he'd said what's mine about a woman he'd never met, she understood why Mabel looked so afraid. Adrian led her through the kitchen, past Leo's averted eyes and trembling hands, to a small office at the back of the diner. The room was cramped and cluttered, stacks of invoices on a metal desk, a calendar from 2 years ago pinned to the wall, the stale smell of old coffee and older paper. It was the kind of space that belonged to Mabel, to the ordinary world Hannah had inhabited just an hour ago. It felt impossibly far away now. A man stood guard at the door, tall, broad, with close-cropped grey hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen too much and stopped being surprised by any of it. He nodded once at Adrian as they passed, his eyes flickering briefly to Hannah with an assessment that made her feel like she'd been catalogued and filed away. Silas, Adrian said. No one comes in. Understood. The door closed behind them. Hannah stood near the desk, her arms wrapped around herself, her heart still racing from everything she'd witnessed. Adrian remained by the door for a moment, as if gathering himself before turning to face her. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. "You wanted the truth," he said finally. "So here it is." He moved to the window, small, grimy, looking out at nothing but the back lot and a rusted dumpster. His reflection stared back at him, ghost-like against the fading afternoon light. "My name is Adrian Cole. My family has operated along the eastern seaboard for 4 generations. We control shipping routes, distribution networks, financial channels that never appear on any legitimate ledger. Politicians owe us favors. Law enforcement knows better than to look too closely. The men you saw out there would kill or die on my word without hesitation." He spoke the words without pride, without menace. Just facts, the way someone might describe the weather or the time of day. "I run what most people would call a criminal empire," he continued, "though I prefer to think of it as an alternative economy, one that operates in silence, without the flash and violence that draws attention. I don't need the world to know my name. I don't need fear to maintain control. Power, real power, doesn't announce itself, it simply exists." Hannah listened, her mind struggling to reconcile the man standing before her with the reality he was describing. A crime lord, a mafia boss. The kind of figure she'd only encountered in movies, in late-night cable dramas, in cautionary tales about women who trusted the wrong men. She should have been terrified. She should have been calculating escape routes, looking for weapons, planning how to get as far from Adrian Cole as humanly possible. Instead, she found herself asking the one question that had lodged itself in her chest like a splinter. "Why did you say I was yours?" Adrian went still. The composure that had carried him through violence and its aftermath, through revelation and confession, cracked like ice beneath sudden weight. His reflection in the window seemed to waver, fracture, become something less certain. "You don't know me," Hannah pressed. "We've never met. I'm nobody, a pregnant waitress in a roadside diner. Why would you claim me?" He didn't answer immediately. When he finally turned to face her, something in his expression had shifted. The mask was gone. What remained beneath it was raw, wounded human in a way she hadn't expected. "I had a sister," he said. "Grace. She was 23 when she died. Pregnant, like you. About as far along." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. 15 years ago, I was 19, just starting to understand my place in the family business. Grace had distanced herself from all of it, wanted nothing to do with our world, our money, our sins. She was going to be a teacher. She was going to raise her baby far from everything our family represented. Adrian's voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. Hannah found herself holding her breath, afraid that any sound might shatter whatever fragile thing had opened between them. We were at a convenience store, just a stop on the way somewhere else, somewhere I don't even remember now. A robbery. 2 men with guns, desperate, strung out, looking for quick cash from the register. He paused. His hands, those hands that had shattered a man's arm without hesitation, hung at his sides like they didn't know what to do with themselves. One of them grabbed Grace, held a gun to her head. I was right there. I had training even then. I knew how to disarm a man, how to move, how to end a threat before it could follow through. But I hesitated. The word fell between them like a verdict. I told myself I was calculating angles, assessing risks, waiting for the right moment. But the truth is I was scared. Scared of making a mistake. Scared of getting her killed if I moved too fast. So I waited. I hesitated. And while I was hesitating, his partner panicked and pulled the trigger. Hannah's hand rose to cover her mouth. Tears she hadn't felt coming spilled down her cheeks. She died in my arms, Adrian said. Her and the baby both. Because I waited. Because I thought caution was the same as protection. He met her eyes, and in them she saw 15 years of grief compressed into a single unguarded moment. I swore that day I would never hesitate again. Never wait when action was required. Never let fear cost me someone else I could have saved. The room felt smaller somehow. Closer. As if the walls had drawn in to hold the weight of his confession. "When I saw him grab you," Adrian continued, his voice rough, "when I saw you wrap your arm around your belly the way Grace wrapped hers around hers." He stopped, swallowed, tried again. "I wasn't saving you. Not really. I was trying to save her. To go back to that convenience store and move when I should have moved. To be the brother she deserved instead of the coward who let her die." Hannah stood frozen, tears streaming freely now. She saw him differently in this moment. Not as a crime lord, not as a violent stranger, not as a man to be feared, just as a man still haunted by a failure he could never undo. A man who had spent 15 years trying to outrun a guilt that would never let him go. What was her name? She asked softly, though she already knew. She needed him to say it, needed to give him the chance to speak it aloud, in a space that wasn't filled with violence or blood. Adrian's composure shattered completely. For a single breath he was 19 again, holding his sister in a convenience store parking lot, watching the light leave her eyes. Grace, he whispered. Her name was Grace. The word hung between them like a prayer, like an offering, like the first fragile thread of something neither of them had expected to find in a roadside diner on an ordinary afternoon that had become anything but. Hannah wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. She should have been afraid of him. She wasn't. She was beginning to understand. Hours passed like water through cupped hands. Slowly at first, then all at once. The diner emptied. Adrian's men completed their work with quiet efficiency, erasing every trace of the afternoon's violence until the space looked almost normal again. Almost. Hannah could still see the ghost of shattered plates on the floor, still feel the phantom grip around her wrist, still hear the echo of bone breaking in the afternoon stillness. Night fell outside the grimy windows, painting the parking lot in shades of purple and black. The neon sign above the entrance flickered to life. Mabel's Diner, glowing pink against the darkness, casting long shadows through the glass. Hannah sat in the corner booth that Adrian had occupied earlier. Someone had brought her water, tea, a sandwich she hadn't touched. Her hands lay folded on the table, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the walls around her. Adrian approached slowly, sliding into the seat across from her. The violence that had defined him hours ago was gone, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. He looked almost ordinary in the dim light, just a man with tired eyes and old grief, waiting for permission to speak. My people have handled Travis, he said. He won't bother you again. None of them will. You have my word. Hannah nodded but said nothing. I've also spoken with Mabel. Your job is secure. She understands the situation and won't hold any of this against you. Another nod. Still nothing. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table. Hannah, look at me. She did. His eyes met hers with an intensity that would have frightened her this morning. Now, after everything she'd witnessed and everything she'd learned, it felt almost comforting. I want to offer you something, he said. Protection. A safe place to stay, somewhere better than wherever you're living now. Medical care for you and the baby. Money if you need it. Anything you need to get through the next few months and beyond. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Why? Because you need it. And because I have the means to provide it. That's not what I'm asking. Adrian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. No strings, he said. No expectations. No conditions. You wouldn't owe me anything. You wouldn't be obligated to stay if you wanted to leave. I'm not asking for anything in return. She studied his face, searching for the catch, the hidden clause, the inevitable moment when generosity would reveal itself as a cage. She'd learned that lesson young. Her father had taught her with every broken promise, every disappearance, every excuse that sounded like love but felt like abandonment. Ryan had reinforced it with smooth words and smoother exits. Every man who'd ever looked at her with something resembling kindness had eventually shown his true face. But Adrian had already shown his true face. He'd broken a man's arm to protect her. He'd confessed his deepest wound without asking for anything in return. He'd stood guard over her for hours without expectation, without pressure, without the impatient hunger she'd learned to recognize in men who wanted something. I don't understand you, she admitted. I know. I've spent my whole life trusting the wrong people, or trusting no one at all. I don't know how to do this. Accept help. Believe that someone actually wants to give it without taking something back. Adrian nodded slowly. There was no judgment in his expression, no frustration at her hesitation, just patience and something that might have been recognition. Your father, he said quietly. He left? Hannah's jaw tightened. When I was 12, decided he wanted a different life, one that didn't include a wife and daughter. And the baby's father? Gone before the test results were dry, couldn't handle the responsibility. She laughed, but it was hollow. Story of my life. Every man who was supposed to protect me decided I wasn't worth the effort. Adrian's expression shifted. The patience remained, but beneath it she glimpsed something harder. Anger, perhaps, on her behalf. They were fools, he said simply. All of them. Maybe. Or maybe I'm the fool for expecting anything different. Silence settled between them. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the interstate, its headlights sweeping briefly across the windows before disappearing into the night. Why me? Hannah asked finally. You could have anyone. You have money, power, men who follow your every command. Why risk everything for a pregnant waitress in a roadside diner? Adrian considered the question. She watched him turn it over in his mind, examining it from angles she couldn't see. "Because you didn't beg," he said at last. Hannah frowned. "What? When he grabbed you? When he reached for your child? You didn't scream. You didn't plead for someone to save you. You wrapped your arm around your belly and prepared to take whatever came. Alone, unaided, without any expectation that help would arrive." His voice had grown softer, rougher, weighted with something she couldn't name. "That's not weakness, Hannah. That's the kind of strength people like me spend our entire lives searching for. The ability to face the worst and stand anyway. To protect what matters, even when protection seems impossible." She felt something shift in her chest. A wall that had stood for years, mortared with disappointment and reinforced with fear, developed a crack. Light seeped through, tentative, fragile, easily extinguished. She should say no, she knew that. Every survival instinct she'd honed over 23 years screamed at her to walk away, to find her own path, to refuse help from a man who operated in shadows and controlled empires built on silence. But survival had given her nothing but loneliness. Caution had left her pregnant and alone, facing eviction, counting tips that would never be enough. Maybe it was time to take a different kind of risk. "I don't need saving," she said quietly. Adrian's lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. The first crack in his composure that felt like warmth instead of grief. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm asking, not telling." Hannah held his gaze. In his eyes she saw something she hadn't expected to find. Not desire, though perhaps that existed somewhere beneath the surface. Not possession, despite his earlier words. Just recognition. Two broken people who had stumbled into each other's orbit and discovered, against all odds, that their jagged edges might fit together. "Okay," she heard herself say. The word emerged small, uncertain, terrifying in its simplicity.
"Okay?"
Adrian's expression softened. Relief flickered across his features before he composed himself again. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me. I'm not sure I do, not yet, but I'm willing to try. That's enough. That's more than enough." And in that moment, standing in a diner that still smelled of coffee and violence, Hannah made a choice that would alter the course of two broken lives forever. The black sedan cut through the Tennessee night like a blade through silk. Hannah sat in the back seat, watching the world she knew disappear behind her, the diner's neon glow shrinking in the rearview mirror, the interstate giving way to smaller roads, the scattered lights of civilization fading into darkness, punctuated only by stars and the occasional farmhouse window. She should have been afraid. An hour ago she'd been a waitress counting tips and dreading eviction notices. Now she was riding in a car that cost more than she'd earn in a decade, heading toward an unknown destination with a man who controlled criminal empires and broke bones without blinking. But fear wasn't what she felt. Something else had taken root in her chest, something fragile and unfamiliar, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen soil. She couldn't name it, wasn't sure she wanted to. Naming things made them real, and real things could be lost. Adrian sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, far enough that their bodies never touched. He hadn't reached for her hand, hadn't put an arm around her shoulders, hadn't made any move that could be interpreted as claiming what he'd earlier called his. He'd simply opened a door. What she did with it was her choice. Silas Mercer drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Occasionally his gaze flickered to the rearview mirror, checking on them, checking on the darkness behind them, checking for threats that Hannah couldn't see but knew existed somewhere in the shadows. After nearly an hour, the car turned onto a private road, trees pressed close on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. Then the forest fell away and Hannah caught her breath. The estate emerged from the darkness like something out of a dream. A sprawling stone house surrounded by manicured grounds, lit by soft landscape lighting that made it glow against the night. Gardens stretched toward distant tree lines. A fountain murmured somewhere out of sight. The air smelled of pine and honeysuckle and something clean, something untouched by the grime and grease of roadside diners. Silas pulled the car to a stop before the main entrance. Adrian stepped out first, then turned and offered Hannah his hand. She took it. His palm was warm, his grip gentle but steady. He helped her from the car with a care that made her throat tighten, then released her the moment she found her footing. No lingering, no possession, just assistance, freely given and freely withdrawn. Inside, the house was even more impressive. Hardwood floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. Artwork lined the walls. Originals, she suspected, though she couldn't have named a single artist. A grand staircase curved toward the upper floors, its banister polished to a mirror shine. Adrian led her upstairs without commentary, without the pride of a man showing off his wealth. He moved through these halls the way she moved through Mabel's diner, with the automatic familiarity of someone who had stopped seeing the details long ago. The room he brought her to was at the end of a quiet hallway. He opened the door and stepped aside, letting her enter first. Hannah walked into a space designed for comfort. A queen bed dominated one wall, piled with pillows and covered in soft linens. A sitting area occupied the corner near tall windows that looked out over the moonlit grounds. Fresh flowers rested on the nightstand. A small refrigerator hummed in the corner, and when she opened it, she found water, juice, fresh fruit, yogurt, everything a pregnant woman might crave at odd hours. A door led to a private bathroom. Another opened into a walk-in closet where clothes in various sizes hung waiting, comfortable things, practical things, nothing ostentatious or revealing. Someone had prepared this room specifically for her. Someone had thought about what she might need and provided it before she could ask. "Rest," Adrian said from the doorway. "You've been through enough today. We can talk more tomorrow when you're ready." Hannah turned to face him. He stood at the threshold like a man who understood boundaries, who wouldn't cross into her space without explicit invitation. The criminal king who commanded armies and shattered bones with his bare hands waited at her door like a servant awaiting permission. "Adrian," he paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, too small to contain everything they needed to hold. "For not hesitating." Something in his expression shifted. The composure cracked, and beneath it she glimpsed the 19-year-old boy who had held his sister in a parking lot and watched her die. For 15 years he had carried the weight of that hesitation. For 15 years he had punished himself for a failure he could never undo. And now, in a quiet room in a house built on shadows, a pregnant waitress he'd known for less than a day was offering him something he hadn't realized he needed. Absolution. "Thank you," he said softly, "for letting me." Their eyes held for a moment that stretched like honey, slow, golden, impossibly sweet. Then Adrian nodded once, stepped back, and pulled the door closed behind him. Hannah stood alone in the silence. She crossed to the bed and sat on its edge, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. The baby kicked twice, quick and strong, as if sensing the change in their circumstances. She smiled despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "It's okay," she whispered. "I think we're going to be okay." For the first time in 7 months, she believed it. Downstairs, Adrian stood at a window in the study, watching the night settle over his grounds. The moon hung low and full above the trees, casting silver light across the gardens he rarely noticed, and the fountain he'd forgotten he owned. Silas appeared beside him, silent as always, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. He offered one to Adrian, who took it without looking away from the darkness beyond the glass. "She's going to be trouble," Silas said. His voice carried no judgment, no warning, just observation, the kind of truth that old friends offered without expectation of response. Adrian lifted the glass to his lips. The whiskey burned, going down, familiar and grounding. "I know," he said, but for the first time in 15 years, those words didn't feel like a warning, they felt like a beginning. So that's how it started. Violence, protection, and 2 people too broken to ask for help, finding it anyway. If this story stayed with you, drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see what happens next between Hannah and Adrian, like and subscribe. More is coming.